said, I prefer to be making this speech in Manchester, where I was yesterday. Unfortunately, logistical difficulties make that impossible, but the irony of pronouncing on education in the north from the smug south isn't lost on me. My last annual report in December painted a stark picture of a nation divided at the age of 11. Too many children in the North and Midlands, I reported, are being taught in schools that are simply not good enough. Nearly 1 in 3 secondaries there requires improvement or is inadequate, compared to 1 in 5 elsewhere. Of the 16 local authorities nationally with the poorest performing secondary schools, 13 were above a line from the Bristol Channel to the Wash. It's fair to say that not all parts of the North and Midlands perform poorly. Many are good, and a few, of course, are exceptional. It's also the case that there are areas in the South that are educational laggards. But overall, there is a significant discrepancy in performance between the North and the South. According to the Sunday Times Schools Guide, only a third of the best state schools are in the North and the Midlands. Manchester and Liverpool illustrate the scale of the problem. 3 in 10 secondary schools in Manchester and 4 in 10 in Liverpool require improvement or are inadequate, compared to 1 in 10 in inner London. The situation in some of their satellite towns is even worse. A third of the schools in Rochdale are not good enough, as is a similar proportion in Salford. In Oldham, 6 in 10 secondaries require improvement or are inadequate, and in Knowsley, not a single secondary school is good or better. Fewer than half of all children in these 6 local authorities achieved 5 good GCSEs last year, compared to a national average of just over 57%. Pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds fared particularly badly. In inner London, almost half of pupils eligible for free school meals were awarded 5 good GCSEs last year. In Greater Manchester, however, just under a third were successful. In Liverpool, it was around a quarter, and in Knowsley, only 1 in 5 pupils eligible for free school meals achieved 5 good GCSEs. Manchester and Liverpool are at the core of our ambitions for a northern powerhouse. They are the engines that could transform the prospects of the entire region. But as far as secondary education is concerned, they're not firing on all 4 cylinders. In fact, they seem to be going in some ways into reverse. The proportion of Manchester pupils gaining good GCSEs declined from 51.4% 2 years ago to 47.5% now. In Liverpool, the percentage fell from 49.9% to 48.6% over the same period. Since I spelt out Ofsted's concerns last year, several commentators have argued that disadvantage explains the difference. The North is relatively poor and the South rich. But if poverty is the culprit, why are primary schools in the North and Midlands doing so well? There's little difference in inspection outcomes for primaries in these areas and those in the rest of the country. How can deprivation explain disappointment at secondary school, yet fail to impede progress at primary? Poverty does not wait to kick in at 11 years of age. I do not underestimate how difficult it is to educate children who are poor and who lack all the advantages a middle-class background confers. I have recent experience of that sort of issue. I spent most of my professional career trying to enthuse children whom others have written off. It isn't easy for schools to compensate for social disadvantage, but never make the mistake that because it's difficult, schools can't make a difference. They can, and many do. Others claim that it isn't poverty, but ethnicity that accounts for the discrepancy. London has outperformed the rest, so the argument goes, because children of immigrants tend to be more ambitious. London benefits disproportionately because 37% of its citizens were born overseas. whereas the rest of the country has higher proportions of the lowest performing ethnic group, white Britons, on free school meals. Yet parts of inner city Liverpool and Manchester are no strangers to immigration. Some 25% of residents in Manchester were foreign born, while Leicester, which is a minority white population, is one of the worst performing local authority areas in the country. Only half of its pupils achieved 5 good GCSEs. Conversely, Newcastle, where 85% of secondary schools are good or better, and where on average 57.3% of students achieve 5 good GCSEs, has far fewer immigrants. Only 6% of its citizens were born overseas. Clearly, school progress or decline cannot be explained solely by ethnic background. Is it then a question of funding? Inner London boroughs historically benefited from much higher per pupil funding than elsewhere because they were amongst the most deprived. But Manchester and Liverpool also do relatively well, especially when the effects of increased London pay are stripped out. Around 2/3 of any extra money London receives is spent on higher wages for staff. Higher spend doesn't automatically lead to better performance. Nottingham, which is one of the highest per pupil funding settlements in the country, outside London, has one of the worst records at secondary. Only 42.4% of its youngsters got 5 good GCSEs, including English and Maths, last year. Yes, London has advantages that other cities lack. But what of Liverpool and Manchester? Are you really telling me that they lack swagger and dynamism? That they cannot succeed in the way that London has succeeded? These are the cities that built Britain. They pioneered a modern civic education when students at certain other universities spend most of their time studying the New Testament in Greek. Today, Manchester and Liverpool boast 8 universities between them, 2 of which are among the top 200 in the world. They are beacons of higher educational excellence. But if these cities can provide a world-class education for youngsters at 18, why on earth are they failing to do so for too many at the age of 11 and beyond? At some point, we have to accept that our children's education can be better or indeed worse because of the choices that we make. At some point, politicians in Manchester and Liverpool will have to accept that the northern powerhouse will splutter and die if their youngsters lack the skills to sustain it. Back in the early 90s, the prospects of schools in Hackney, where I taught, seemed to be as bleak as many areas in the North and Midlands seem today. Only 14%, 1/4, of youngsters in the borough gained a good GCSE in 1990. Leadership turned things round. But school leaders didn't do it by themselves. They had recognisable local champions, politicians like Jules Pipe in Hackney, the Mayor of Hackney, and Robin Wales in Newham, who took responsibility for the performance of their local schools. All schools, not just those under their direct control. They expected results and refused to accept excuses from many of them. Their priority was, and remains, the better education of all children, no matter where they went. They did not allow varying school structures to deflect them from their objective. All children in every school were their children in their boroughs, and all schools would be held to account for their performance. This is what needs to happen now in Manchester and in Liverpool. I appreciate that isn't easy, and I accept that improvement can't happen overnight. I understand that it's a lot easier to teach children who don't come to school hungry, who live in homes filled with books, who have parents who are employed, let alone university educated. Nor am I calling for a return to micromanagement of schools by town halls or for new local educational powers. I want to make that absolutely clear. But I am talking about political will and political vision. I am calling on local politicians, be they mayors, council leaders or cabinet members, to stand up and be counted, to shoulder responsibility for their local schools, to challenge and support them regardless of whether they're academies, free schools or local authority schools. I'm calling on them to be visible, high-profile figures that people can recognise as education champions in their areas and in their cities. I'm calling on them to make education in general and the underperforming secondary schools in particular a central target of their strategy for regional growth. I'm asking them to better understand that unless there are high standards in the major cities of our country, then good practice will not radiate out to the satellite towns and communities outside those cities. Unless they do, I fear Manchester and Liverpool will never become the economic powerhouses we want them to be, and certainly the government wants them to be. We cannot fight for social mobility without political immobility. Politicians, therefore, need to act. It requires grit, imagination, faith, and bloody-mindedness, qualities that, fortunately, I really don't think are less common in the north than they are in London and the south. Thank you.